Afternoon. Welcome to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative winter webinar series. It is getting light out, staying light out later, so we're coming into spring. I know it might not feel like it wherever you are, certainly doesn't feel like it in Minnesota, but I promise you one thing we can depend on is that spring is going to come. So I'm just going to walk us through really quickly some of the wow, that lobby screen coming up is really distracting. I'm going to walk us through some of the Teams functionality. And then, of course, why does it do this to me? It just goes away, guys. Why does it do that? No one knows. I'm going to go back. Okay. Woohoo! You get to see me twice. I know it's very exciting. So I just want to walk you through some of the accessibility things and the functionality in Teams to make this somewhat interactive when we get to the Q&A after the two presentations that we have today. We want you to use some of these functions. So if you have a question, we're not going to use the raise hand button because when there's a lot of folks on, I can't tell who raised their hand first. And it's hard to scroll through the participants list. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it old school. And if you can just type into the chat, I have a question or hand or me next. And we're going to try to make sure that if you do have a question, if you could give voice to that question and put your camera on when you do. It's always nice on a winter webinar to feel like we're talking to real people. If you don't have camera functionalities or you're not able to give voice to your question, that's okay. I'll read it for you. You can type it into the chat. And so you can do that as we go on. Different presenters may answer as they're presenting, and others may prefer to wait until the end. And so we're just going to defer to Dan and myself to do what works best for us. I tend to get distracted easily, so sometimes I can't keep track of your questions as I'm talking and stay on time. So it's a lot to juggle. So this is the chat function right here, this little pop-up bubble that you have. If somebody says something really amazing and great, feel free to use these just to keep it interactive. I really like this happy applause one. If you can laugh at something somebody says something really shocking, you can be like, oh my. So that's a good one too. These three little dots right here are the link to your accessibility needs. So you can turn on live captions at any time. Microsoft Teams does a pretty decent job of capturing everything that we're saying. It just turns on captions for you. It doesn't turn captions on for everybody else on the call. So it's a handy little feature. There's also, you can show the transcript, which is a running log of the captions while it's going. So just want to make sure that's available to everyone. If we are really tiny on your screen, that might be a good thing. But if you want to see us larger or you want to see the content larger, you can click this full screen button here and you'll be able to see the full PowerPoint. All right. I am going to stop sharing this screen, share the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, and then Dan, get ready because then I am going to introduce you. And so get ready to have your camera on and become a real life celebrity in real time. It's very exciting. Dan's ready. He's prepared. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, this is the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative webinar series. I hope that you're familiar with the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, but if you're not, this is your gateway into this fabulous group of folks. So we are a collaboration, truly a collaboration of folks from over 30 different conservation organizations. And really our whole goal is to try to figure out this big wide world of prairie reconstruction. How do we do it? How can we improve it? How can we make sure that we're not trying things that have already been tried by prairie practitioners 30 or 50 years ago and they found out it didn't work? Like, we want to get better and be on this continuous improvement journey. So our goal is that prairie reconstructions are biologically diverse, ecologically functional, they resist invasion by non-native plants, and are cost effective to manage. Doesn't that sound like the Holy Grail? Sounds pretty great to me. You can join the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative and get updates about the work that we're doing, like our awesome database where we can enter in Prairie Reconstruction data so that we can all learn from each other to get better at what we're all collectively trying to do. By joining our listserv, and I think Jamie or somebody else is going to put a link to that in the chat so that you don't miss any of these updates. And this is a throwback photo from 2019 when we were all in the field together, so happy, frolicking on a prairie and a prairie reconstruction. So without further ado, I'm going to have Dan introduce himself, and then I'll introduce myself. I'm not ready to introduce myself. It's weird to facilitate and introduce yourself. I'll have Dan start and introduce himself because we're going to give you a two-part series today on pollinator-friendly solar with Prairie Reconstruction. So Dan, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Megan. So I'm Dan Shaw with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. I've been with the agency about 15 years. I'm a senior ecologist and vegetation specialist. I work on a pretty wide range of different conservation projects. Started working on habitat solar efforts back in 2016 after some legislation. So look forward to the opportunity to talk to you today about the program.
Perfect. Dan is a person that I talk to probably every week because he's so knowledgeable and so great and has so many good ideas. So I'm excited that we can do this together as a tag team. And Dan, you don't have to stay on camera the whole time if you don't want to. So I'm Megan Benage. I'm a regional ecologist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. I cover southern Minnesota, 32 counties in southern Minnesota. So if you cut the state in half, basically everything except for the boot. My work focuses on rare species, prairie restoration, prairie conservation in general, and then I do a bunch of work with industry to try to figure out how we can get better at stackable benefits on the landscape. And so the first thing that I'm going to talk to you about is our pollinator-friendly solar prairie establishment and maintenance tech guidance. Basically where we're working with solar industries to try to get more habitat acres on land. So that is the goal for today. And my plan is to take just 15 to 20 minutes. Then Dan's going to present for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Sound great? Everybody excited? Woo! Webinars! I love when everybody's muted because I have no idea if you're excited or not. I'm gonna say that you are. Okay, I'm gonna move some things around here. All right, we're gonna jump right in. Look at this beautiful solar site. All that black-eyed Susan. It's so nice. I'm trying to figure out which button I pressed to advance my slides. Okay. This is the joy of two screens and the problem of two screens all at the same time. My little buttons aren't where I want them to be. All right, here we go. Okay, so why pollinator-friendly solar? What does that even mean? And I know that some land managers, when they were reviewing the tech guidance, they came to us and they said, pollinator-friendly solar, you're just trying to make prairie habitat. Like, that's what you're trying to do. You're right. That is exactly what we're trying to do. But the idea is we need to make this be appetizing and saleable to the industry. And so the way to do that is to sort of blanket this as pollinator friendly. We also know that many of our pollinator species are in trouble. And so we saw this as a way to, again, provide these stackable benefits on the landscape. So our goal is to try to get habitat that does what prairie plantings do, right? We want to provide food for butterflies, bees, and insects that pollinate wildflowers and sometimes commercial crops. So that's the goal. We think it is a super great thing to do, and I'm going to get into why we think that's great. I'm also going to cover some of the establishment methods and some of the maintenance methods. And so I should say right out the gate that one of the I know it's hard to start with criticisms, but I'll start with it. One of the criticisms that we hear is that folks say to us, well, you're trying to ask the industry to restore at this high quality level, similar to what DNR or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing. False. That is not what we're trying to do. We actually designed the standards really thoughtfully so that they could be at kind of a medium level, and in some cases a minimum level, so that if we're going to call this pollinator habitat, it actually does that. It provides pollinator habitat, right? But we also wanted to make sure that we weren't doing the biggest, best restoration ever, because that may not be appropriate on a utility scale solar site. I think you could do that, but there are some limitations in terms of species height and other things that we have to consider. So in Minnesota, solar is booming. So right now we have operating about 262 megawatts of commercial solar or utility scale solar. So anything that's over 50 megawatts in size. We have about 180 megawatts that's permitted but not constructed. By 2024, we're expected to increase that another 1,662 megawatts. And I know that's a lot of numbers to throw at you right after lunch. So just to break that down for you, we're about to increase solar in the next 2 years by roughly 8 times what we have operating now. Now, I'm just talking about utility scale solar. I'm not talking about sites that are under 50 megawatts. I don't have those numbers because bless you, because the state mostly just permits anything that's 50 megawatts or more in size, if that makes sense. So the whole idea with pollinator friendly, while we're approaching this big boom in the solar industry, is we know that the prairie's in trouble. We know that we're in a fragmented landscape, and we know that we want to be able to do better. Enter a perfect partnership opportunity. So we could have solar sites that typically have gravel or turf underneath the panels, or we could have solar sites that have native vegetation that improve soil health, they retain water, they're providing habitat, they could even be providing food or forage for grazing animals, and we get to provide low-cost energy. So would you rather have a solar facility site that can do one thing, produce energy, or that can do all of these stackable benefits? I know what I want. I want the stackables. I like stackables. I like Lunchables. Even better. So when we think about pollinator friendly, we're looking at the main principles of designing, I don't want to say good, maybe decent prairie habitat is what we should say. Trying to be decent. So diversity makes the world go round, right? So the goal is we want to make sure that our diversity is high enough so that we have functionality for wildlife, so that we can do all of those stackable benefits that I already mentioned earlier. And we also want that to contribute, hopefully, to easier management and maintenance by the solar industry, who is going to be managing those sites. So we're hoping that we can have a high enough level of diversity that we can have some resistance to plant invasion, that we can kind of maintain stand integrity, and we can also respond to these climatic extremes, right? Like drought or flooding and those sorts of things. The other key thing is that because many of these sites in Minnesota, they're going into the prairie areas. Okay, why is that, right? You're trying to capture the sun. Well, if you're trying to capture the sun, it's better to do it in an open landscape than it is to do it under the trees in Northeast Minnesota or in Northwest Minnesota or in parts of Southeast Minnesota. I realize I'm just saying the whole rest of the state. You want to do it in these open landscapes, right? Because that's how you maximize energy capture from the sun. So that's the goal. I was going to tell you something really great here, but I forget what it was. So we're going to move on. I'm sure if I remember it, I will cover it, or Dan will cover it for me, because that's what Dan does. He helps me out. Oh yeah, it's right on the slide. So because most of these solar sites are going up in predominantly agriculture, previously prairie parts of Minnesota, one of the things that planting into these native plantings does is it really boosts your organic matter, increase your soil health. And the reason I want to focus on that just a little bit is because in 25 years, which is kind of an average solar lease, these sites may be decommissioned. And if they're decommissioned, they would go back in agricultural land. They can also be renewed, but there's a benefit to the agricultural community if you're spending that 25 years building organic matter with the extensive root systems of these native plants, right? There's a huge benefit to that versus just being turf with really shallow roots or gravel. So it makes it, what I'm trying to say is it makes it more attractive to the communities that these sites are being installed within. The other thing that we recently learned, and it's just like one of those moments where you go, how cool is that? Is that because of the roots that these plants produce, and because of how they're growing on these solar sites, is they can actually increase solar panel efficiency. And the way that they do that is they're keeping the panel cooler, so the panel can actually produce more energy. So that's preliminary. There are the NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, is doing some of those studies. And the more they're finding, the more that solar sites are coupled with deeper rooted native plantings, there seems to be some co-benefits that are going on. If you're still not convinced that this is the way to go or something that we should be exploring, it's just real pretty. Like, it's way prettier than just turf and gravel. It's super nice. Things to think about. So Minnesota DNR has a whole solar siting guidance document that we're working on revision to right now. Some of the biggest things that we're concerned about is we don't want these solar panels to go into existing native habitat, right? Because there's problems with that. We already know the prairie is fragmented. We already know that it's struggling, and our goal is to connect it as much as possible. We see these solar sites and these stackable benefits being a way, like a novel way to enhance habitat, not a way to take up habitat that's already in trouble and that's certainly needed for just the sake of maintaining the prairie as a whole, right? So a couple things we want to look at. We want to look at soil type, super duper important. We want to look at soil drainage, arguably one of the most important things you can look at when siting a solar facility. Are there any natural areas nearby? Is there high value habitat, the existing calcareous fens, wetlands, existing native prairie, that sort of thing. And the goal is that if you're going to be planting pollinator-friendly solar, habitat-friendly solar, that you're matching your seed mix, just as we would do in any prairie reconstruction or restoration, right? You want to match your seed mix to your soil type. That is key for success. The other thing that we often see on these solar sites is they're siting in wetlands. And it's not just because there's not value seen for those wetlands. It's that oftentimes, because of the current technology that we have, you have to be a certain distance away from an existing transmission line in order to pull that power into it. And so sometimes there may be like 5 sites that they can choose from that make sense based on where the current infrastructure is. And so what we see and what we want to avoid is siting these in wetlands, because it just leads to all kinds of problems. Solar panels sink, solar panels get highly invaded by invasive species. There's all kinds of vegetation management and establishment issues, which means there's issues with site permits. It just becomes kind of a mess. And I love this example, so I can also talk about this example because it's not a Minnesota example. So if you look at the photo here, this is an example of celery bog in Indiana, where I moved here from. And what I love about this, and I can say this too, because I went to Purdue University. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to build a road going across celery bog. And so when they looked at the first design specs, it was recommended that they build an overpass, right? That they not build the road bisecting the bog, because it's a bog and has unstable soils. Well, what they did is they said, well, that overpass is 3 times as expensive as just building the road through the bog. So what we're going to do is build the road through the bog. There were lots of advising against it. Folks said, don't do this. You don't want to do this. This isn't a good plan. You don't want to put your solid infrastructure on these unstable soils. They did it anyway. A couple months after construction completed, road sank. It's underwater. What did they do? Smart Purdue engineering. They said, we know how to fix this. That's what we're going to do. We're going to sink a bunch of stuff into the wetland so that it can support the road. So they did. They sunk all kinds of things, concrete pilings, just all kinds of construction materials, and they rebuilt the road. 3 months later, road sinks, underwater, unstable soils. They come back to the table, they go, we know how to fix this. We know what to do. We're going to sink more stuff in there. We just didn't sink enough stuff in there the first time. So they put more stuff in, construct the road again. Road sinks again. They come back to the table. What we need here is an overpass. Is everybody following along? They build an overpass that is now 8 times more expensive than the original proposed overpass because they've had to rebuild this road so many times. The reason why I'm providing this example is that nature always wins. So when we are thinking about constructing, when we're thinking about industry, we need to work smarter, not harder, and make sure that even if something is the more expensive option, it might be the right or best option so that it doesn't cost us more in the long run. And I just love that example because it's it's just classic. We think we can engineer our way out of nature, but the reality is most of the time we cannot. Nature's gonna win. So a couple things that we talk with solar developers about when they're building these seed mixes so that they're matching site conditions. We really want to pay attention to source. We want to make sure that things are regionally appropriate, right? We want to look at seed mix cost. Again, this is not the Cadillac version of pollinator habitat. It's more similar to conservation reserve program or a more basic seed mix that will provide some habitat benefits, but not necessarily meeting the needs of all species. Right, so in our seed mix design, there are a couple options. You can do higher quality seed mixes, and then you could mix those with grass only seed mixes underneath the panel. You could do things like a pollinator lawn. There are all kinds of options. So it's sort of a novel world. It's not necessarily that only native species would get selected for this. Although Dan and I go back and forth about that a lot. Same basic seed mix rules apply here. So you want to make sure that you have a minimum seeding rate of 40 seeds per square foot. That makes sure you get enough seed on the ground so that you can have establishment. The other thing that solar sites have to consider is that they're doing a lot of grading. They're doing construction of those panels. And so as they're doing the grading and construction of those panels, they need to make sure that they're not compacting the soil so much that they don't get any seed establishment. And we have seen a couple sites fail because the soils were too compacted. And that's pretty rare. And if you do a lot of prairie reconstruction, it's pretty rare to see things fail. I've only had 2 failures in my entire career, and one was because the seed was stolen and not planted, and the second was because we had herbicide carryover. So important things to consider. We want to use 7 native grass or sedge species with at least 2 species of bunch grass. The total seeding rate, we want to be about 40% wildflowers or forbs. We want to make sure that we're fulfilling those guilds or those functional groups, right? It's important to have warm season grasses, cool season grasses, sedges and rushes, legumes and non-legume forbs. And that's just making sure that we're getting not just a full suite for pollinators, but also a full suite for functionality in that planting. On that same line, we want to make sure we include species from different families, and our minimum that we set is 20 or more native wildflowers with at least 5 species in each bloom period. I know if you're familiar with the federal programs, I believe it's 3 species in each bloom period. We don't think that's quite enough to establish pollinator habitat, because if 1 or even 2 of those species don't establish, you're relying on 1 plant to basically carry the load for all of the pollinators, and that just seems like not enough. So we can use temporary covers, and because it's a solar site, the only time that we really see folks using taller grasses like big blue, big blue stem or Indian grass or some of those other things would be in the perimeter of the planting. We really avoid doing that in the array area because we don't want to shade out the panel. It's one of the things that solar developers are most concerned about. They want to maximize that solar resource. So then our guidance goes into establishment phase. What are the things that you should do? This is 0 to 5 years for the solar companies. They can mow, they can hay. I guarantee you, I think there's a way to do prescribed fire, but it was a non-starter when we brought it up with the solar companies. I have never seen so many people look so scared. Because if you think about it, solar panels are expensive, and thinking about running fire through your very expensive electrical grid is terrifying, right? So we have to get creative, we have to adapt. We know that prairie plantings and prairie habitat need disturbance. How are we going to do that in this industrial setting? So one of the things we talked to developers about early on is making sure that they site their panels so that they're an appropriate width apart so that they can get maintenance equipment in. We have had so many solar sites where the panels are right next to each other and you cannot get any equipment through a mower or a hay rig. We'll go with it. Any kind of haying equipment. The panels are so narrow that you can't get the tractor through, or you can't turn without hitting a panel. And so that's something we want to make sure that we're considering on the front end so that we're successful in the long term with these projects. You can spot mow, you can spot spray, all of that's totally fine. I think because of the timing delays and what we're seeing right now is that a lot of the solar sites that are coming online for this utility scale solar are particularly large. They're 800 acres or more. We're strongly recommending sequencing because if you're going to use native plants, and we really want people to because there's benefits for them and there's also environmental benefits, right? There's industry benefits, there are environmental benefits too. We want to make sure that you're going to be successful. And because of the reality of seed shortages and other things, if you're talking about a 1,600 acre site, you need to make sure you're sequencing when these things are going to happen. So we strongly encourage that they use a temporary cover or a cover crop while they're waiting. All right, Dan, I'm almost done. So then there's long-term phase management. Typically that again would be haying or mowing. We have to find a way to deal with all of that biomass. So we don't want them to just hay and then leave the residue there because that'll just build up over time. It could smother some of those native plants, those sorts of things. We're still working on what's the right, haying frequency and the right height. We're not quite sure. 12 inches is high for what haying will do, so we're still working on revising what that looks like. My favorite is using sheep for solar sites. I think it's one of the best things that you could do. One, they're adorable. Two, look how happy they look. And it's fun to say that you're providing habitat for sheep, solar, and satisfied pollinators. It's another stackable, right? So if you can get sheep on here, you're also benefiting the ag community by trying to provide a novel source of forage, right? It's another way that we can sort of add another stackable benefit into this. It does have to be done thoughtfully, especially if you're going to manage multiple solar sites with one sheep herd. There's a lot of sequencing involved there with how long are the sheep going to be on this site, this site, this site, this site. And again, we want to be thinking about things like refugia, set aside habitat that's not managed so that the sites still are pollinator friendly. The other thing I learned about sheep this week is that they like to eat wildflowers. That's their preferred over grass. So while that is a good thing and can stimulate the growth, we also want to be extra careful in how the sheep are applied, how the frequency, intensity, timing, and duration are all things that we're going to want to consider. And of course, how do we know that all this is working and how can we do it better with monitoring and adaptive management? So we strongly recommend most of the early solar projects that we saw were working with engineering companies. There's nothing wrong with engineers, but my best day in the field when we looked at these solar sites was when the engineers were explaining to us how the electricity was converted and all of the the pipeline and construction and everything else, and they're using all these fancy terms for the different types of electricity that come in, and then it has to be converted to this certain type of electricity before it can go to the grid. And you just look at all the biologists and ecologists who are on site, and their faces are just like this. Because they are experts in this and they know what's going on. And then we start talking to them about all the different bees that we're seeing and all the flowers and all the different plants. And the engineers' faces are like this. Because we're both scientists and professionals, but we have to figure out how to crosstalk with each other so that we're each excited about what we're doing on site. It's exciting to produce energy in this way. It's also exciting to do it with habitat and all of these benefits. So we strongly recommend that solar companies, to be successful, they really need to be working with restoration professionals, native seed companies, to make sure that the prairie restoration portions of these projects are successful. This is just kind of an idea of how one small idea can kind of blossom, well, pun intended, blossom, pollinator habitat. But so I never expected this when we started this project, but of course, you know, we worked with our partners in Board of Water and Soil. Now we're working with our partners in Department of Commerce. We're also working with our partners in Department of Ag to try to pull all these things together, working with a not-for-profit Fresh Energy. And wouldn't you know it, Bolton Bees has some hives out on these solar sites. So they're collecting, I think, what they call solar honey. And then that honey is being used at Spoon and Stable, which is a restaurant in the cities. They're using it in some of their desserts. And then, of course, because we're Minnesota, we have long winters. We get bored. 56 Brewing took some of that honey and they made it into a special solar beer that they brewed. So again, just think about it. There's stackables at all these different levels, right? On the one hand, it's solar industry. They're trying to produce clean energy. Now we add habitat into that mix and we can start having some of these habitat benefits for wildlife. We can also start seeing some, hopefully, water quality improvements, soil health improvements, all those good things that native vegetation does for us, right? And then it funnels into all of these other industries also. So partnership makes everything work together. I'm really excited about what's happening in Minnesota, and I'm hoping that we can continue to build on this to have another novel way that we get stackable benefits on the landscape. Dan, that's it for me. I'm going to wait and hold questions till the very end so you have enough time to present, because I took way more time than I wanted to.
All right, sounds good, Megan. I'll start loading my presentation. Can you see that okay?
I sure can. You're good.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to be focusing on our Minnesota Habitat Friendly Solar Program. Megan, you did a great job covering co-benefits, so I'm just going to cover that quickly, talk about collaboration on projects, talk about the Habitat Friendly Solar Standard in Minnesota, and then next steps for the state program. This is a mission of the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. There's definitely an emphasis on partnerships, and we've been working on building these partnerships around solar projects. Back in 2013, we developed a pollinator plan for the agency. This was really intended to start defining our action steps around pollinators, and one of the key parts of this was to incorporate pollinator habitat across our conservation programs. And there's many different programs that we work on across landscapes. So we're looking for opportunities to build pollinator habitat for other wildlife species within these different programs. Our agency has about 300,000 acres of conservation easements that have been restored in different ways, different plant communities, cost share programs. We have a lawns and legumes program that's focused on urban areas, and different cost share and different types of programs that are focused on habitat and achieving soil and water conservation goals. So in 2016, there was state legislation focusing on habitat solar projects. And the legislation stated that an owner of a solar site can claim that they are providing beneficial habitat to game birds, songbirds, and pollinators only if they're meeting standard defined or developed by the Board of Water and Soil Resources. The intent of this legislation was to ensure that if a solar developer was coming into a community and claiming that they would be providing pollinator benefits, that it would be an extensive planting, that they wouldn't just have one portion of that site be in pollinator habitat and the rest of it in gravel or turf. And so this began the process of us developing a standard for the state. We started working with a wide range of different partners on this topic. Megan was one of our advisors working on the development of the assessment forms. Some of the goals with our program, as this program has developed, we wanted more than just a standard. We wanted there to be support for groups who are working on habitat solar projects. We saw some opportunities to work with a larger conservation community to involve them with solar projects, and really wanted to think about co-benefits across these landscapes, because these solar projects have potential to really help with our goals around soil and water conservation in addition to pollinator habitat. So these are all goals that Megan talked about, and these are things that we've been promoting as part of these projects. There's a lot happening on this slide, but it's intended to show the bigger picture of collaboration on solar projects to accomplish co-benefits. So starting with policy development, different groups involved with thinking about policy, interagency guidance. This includes the DNR guidance, guidance through the Department of Commerce and Bowser. Our program, then outreach and education, on the ground management, field inspections, and research. So really a lot of different organizations that are involved in solar projects in different ways. With our guidance and our standard, the DNR, solar technical guidance plays a really important role in providing a standard of how to establish habitat on these sites. So we refer solar developers to this information who are starting projects. We've worked with Xerxes Society on guidance on how to protect conservation plantings from pesticides. This was actually developed before our solar work. It was developed for many of our conservation easements, but has been a useful resource for solar projects as well, since many of them are located next to agricultural landscapes. Megan talked about seed mixes. We've been collaborating on some state seed mixes for solar projects. Currently, there's a solar array mix for the south and west parts of the state, solar array mix for the Northeast, and then a low-growing array mix for moist soils in the south and west parts of the state. So the resources that we work on that we've been working to include more solar information into these resources. That includes our What's Working website, which is a website where we collect practitioner information about what's been successful on their projects. We have a pollinator and biodiversity toolbox. That's our main resource related to pollinator habitat that's intended to help conservation partners think about the steps for conservation planning for habitat for pollinator plantings. And then there's a featured plant archive. We have featured plant articles that come out every month, and also new state pollinator report. Some of the goals when we started developing a standard were to meet the legislative requirement, assist local governments. We do have some local governments that are requiring our standard for any projects that are coming into their geographic area. And Stearns County is a good example where they require that our standard be met in that county. And we think that's going to be something that will be expanding in the future, that there will be more counties or municipalities that will be requiring that the standard be met. Another goal was to provide flexibility in design, maximize the benefits of projects, create consistency across the state. We have seen a lot of different approaches with projects, and there's a couple different scales of projects in the state. There's what we call community scale solar, which tend to be smaller sites, and then utility scale solar projects over 50 megawatts. And those are sites that are around 300 acres or larger. The largest site that's being planned right now in the state is around 3,000 acres. So these can really vary a lot in size. And then ultimately help ensure the success of these projects. This slide summarizes the steps for Minnesota's process, which includes filling out a project planning assessment form. That form is reviewed either by local government staff or by Bowser staff. Once they're approved, they're added to a state list of projects, and then there's inspections to ensure that projects stay on track. And then submitting an established project form for review every 3 years. We want to make sure that these projects are staying on track long term, and that's why we have that requirement for that year 3 form. This is part of our project planning form. You can see the different components of the form. We try to keep this as simple as possible. We wanted this to be a front and back form. The front side, the information that's filled out for a project, and then the back side provides the information about how to fill in the information. So you can see that there's a focus on native species cover for a site, proposed site vegetation cover. That'll be dominated by wildflowers, planned cover diversity, planned seasons with at least 3 blooming species. Number 5, which isn't on here, is about additional habitat components. So ultimately, we're trying to think about the aspects of a site that are going to create integrity for a plant community, provide benefits for pollinators, and help accomplish co-benefits. As Megan noted, there's a lot of work happening and there's a lot of different approaches to these solar projects. And I think we've seen over the last 5 years or so that the approach to restoring these has really varied a lot. There's been a lot of experimentation. We're all learning a lot about how to establish these projects. We've seen a lot of different seed mixes being used. And I think that's an important thing to note, that we're still in the early stages of establishing these projects and learning what's working, what isn't working. And this process and our guidance will just keep evolving as we go. There is quite a bit of research happening around these solar projects. There's different groups that are researching vegetation establishment, the habitat benefits of sites. There's been efforts to look at solar siting. Groundwater has been an emphasis by the University of Minnesota, looking at how solar projects could be sited to have the greatest benefit for groundwater quality. Also research on ag benefits, the permitting needs of projects, and hydrology. I think the research around hydrology and water quality has been really encouraging, finding that these sites really are providing many benefits for treating water that's coming off of the panels and off of these landscapes. I think early on there was concern that there's a lot of water running off of these panels, that there might be runoff coming off of the sites. But ultimately, I think the research is finding that there's very little water that exits these sites because of the prairie vegetation that's established. And then a few next steps for our program, we'll be seeking input about the update and review of assessments. We're trying to make sure that this process that we have in place is working for solar developers and consultants, installers that are working on these projects. We have a habitat-friendly solar summit that's being planned for March 9th. Also working to collaborate and assist counties who are working with the Minnesota standard, and working to further the discussions around consistency and the maintenance needs of projects. I think that'll be a topic that will be ongoing, and all of us who are working on these issues are trying to overcome some of the challenges that we've been seeing on sites. Will be trying to improve information or guidance related to installation methods. And this is a save the date that we have for the Minnesota Habitat Friendly Solar Program, for the summit. And if you go to the website for this program, there's a registration for the summit. So I was going pretty fast there through a lot of information. So if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer any of them.
Good job, Dan. Oh, now I can hear myself twice. That's fun. I'm clapping for you virtually and like this. Oh, and Paul put the link to Habitat Friendly Solar. Good work. I should have been faster and put the DNR links in there. You guys are so fast. Dan, I have a question for you. It's kind of a doozy while we're waiting for folks to think about some questions. You know, we know why this is important, and we feel pretty strongly about habitat friendly solar, but what has the reception been from the solar industry? Like, are they excited about this? I guess, is it positive, and what are their concerns that we most commonly hear?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been trying to talk to a lot of the solar developers and consultants working on these projects, particularly going into our Habitat Solar Summit. And Paul Erdman works with me on this program, and we've been trying to look at any potential changes that are needed for the program. And one aspect of our program is that it essentially is voluntary. That there is a requirement if anybody is going to claim that there's pollinator benefits to a site, that they need to follow the standard and the process. But to a large extent, it's voluntary. So we want to make sure that it's working for solar developers, that the process is something that they can work with as they're developing projects. I think probably the biggest concern we've heard is the additional cost that might be associated with filling out forms, hiring consultants to be on sites, doing the assessments. And so one thing we've been talking about is that we really want groups to be out there doing yearly inspections, and if they can do the yearly inspections, making sure projects are on track, that maybe we don't need a year 3 assessment form. That maybe as long as they can provide information that the yearly assessments are being done and that things are on track, that's going to be sufficient. So I think getting back to your question, the added cost of working with the state program, sending in assessments, is probably the biggest concern. Ultimately, we want this to be a partnership between all of us, because I think we all do have the same goals. I think, for the solar developers, they do want habitat out on these sites. They'd rather see that than turf, and they want it to be successful. They just don't necessarily want more hurdles or it to be more complex. So I think part of our role is to figure out how do we make this a collaboration with solar developers so that we're all working on this together. And I think where we can come in as professionals that have been working on conservation projects for a long time is that we know how to avoid some of the problems with invasive species, how to develop seed mixes, the steps for installing successful projects. We've been doing this kind of work on conservation lands for a long, long time. There's a few differences definitely on these solar projects, but it's not that different than how we've approached prairie reconstruction for a long time.
Great answer. Ryan has a question. Ryan, do you want to give voice to your question, or you want me to read it?
No, I can pipe in. So just curious, as far as you don't really associate prairie as being shade tolerant. So I was just wondering, have you noticed any species or separation of species that are out there that you're using that seem to do better directly under those panels?
Yeah, for sure. I'll take it first and then I'll punt to Dan because so in case we haven't made it super clear, but I hope that we have, we do all this stuff together. So we're like two halves of a whole. So basically, think savanna. So think savanna species. And also think of a solar site as there's the part in between the panel that really is getting mostly full sun, and then there's under the panel. Under panel is certainly challenging. And so we use things like nodding fescue. We've been working with the native seed industry to really develop and expand that. I would love it if Pennsylvania sedge could ever come online and be a viable option propagating from seed, but it just has some establishment hurdles and issues where it seems to establish better as a plug, but it's like a perfect native plant to go underneath. A couple other things, some of our foxglove species are pretty shade tolerant, Canada anemone, some of the hyssops, gosh, I'm trying to, wild garlic, nodding onion, some of our more foresty, that's a word, foresty species, like our spring ephemeral mixes, you could also include. Obviously, they're only going to be up for the spring, but those are some things that you could include under the panel as well. So things like, oh gosh, bloodroot, what's it called? Spring beauty. I'd love to see solar panels with some ferns underneath. That'd be great. It's kind of like miniature novel ecosystems that we're creating here in the shade part of the panel. Other solar companies have come in and used non-native combinations. And so they have used some clover, and I don't mean purple prairie clover, I mean like red clover, white clover, things like that. Dan, what am I missing? I feel like I'm missing some things.
Red fescue has been used quite a bit as well under the panels. Such as is another group of species that we've been thinking about that are somewhat shade tolerant that might help with that need as well. There's definitely less need if the panels rotate or if they're up higher. So sometimes it's related to the design of a site, but I do think that's something that's going to be an evolving topic, trying to figure out how do we find more species that we can use under the panels that are commercially available and within a reasonable cost as well. So that's been the challenging part, trying to figure out that puzzle.
And it is, I mean, we're talking about the partnership between state agencies, but I should also mention, because I see Wes piped into the chat here, there's also a partnership with the native seed industry too, right? Like we want these projects to be successful. It's also an income generating source for our native seed companies. So how can we all work together to make sure we're meeting these mutual goals, but we're doing it in a way that makes sense, right? Like there's going to be challenges through this process. One of the first challenges was, our standard is we want all native species, and from a state perspective, that is really what we want to see out there. But we also have to address the reality that if a seed company doesn't have production available to make it scalable for these thousands and thousands of acre sites, then we have to be realistic about how we do that. So one of the things we worked with on a couple sites were, let's use red fescue now, which is a non-native species. It's common in Minnesota lawn mixes. It's probably in every person's lawn on this call if you're in Minnesota, or really it's a very common lawn species. So probably in your lawn, no matter where you are. So it's one of those that we assessed the risk. We felt the risk was low, and we agreed to use that as an interim strategy while we're scaling production for things like nodding fescue, which are native and we'd rather see out on site. So that's a piece. And somebody asked earlier, I want to make sure it gets answered. I think I misinterpreted your question. When I said there's 1,662 megawatts likely to be installed by 2024, somebody asked what's the translation in acres? It's about 10 acres a megawatt. So multiply that out. 16,060, wait. It should be easy to multiply by 10, but it's the afternoon and I haven't had all my snacks. You get the idea. So multiply 1,662 by 10, roughly, and it can vary. Amanda, would you like to give voice to your question, or would you like me to read it?
I will try. Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Super. So I was just wondering what you've seen with pollinator response. And, you know, early on, there was concern about solar panels posing a mortality risk to insects. Have you seen any of that?
Oh, I was waiting for Dan. So I'll talk about the second part and then I'll let Dan talk about the first part. So I should mention that not all solar panels are created equal. So out west, the type of panel that they use, I don't understand all of the technical terms, so I'm not going to attempt it. But basically, those panels get much hotter, and they also reflect at a different angle in a different way, where they have risk of mortality not just to insects but also to birds in particular, thinking that it's a pond or a landing site, and then they're just cooked when they hit those panels. We do not use those types of panels in Minnesota, so it's a photovoltaic panel. I don't know all of the fancy names for the construction, but it's not that type of panel. So in general, an insect should not be attracted to them in the same way as they would with the Western panels.
Yeah, I think related to the pollinator use of sites, I think everything we've been seeing has been positive. Monarch Joint Venture recently did some monitoring on sites, and they were finding a lot of benefit from different species on solar projects. I think most of the solar site pollinator assessments have been looking at agriculture as a baseline and doing comparisons from an agricultural state to habitat solar. So obviously there's going to be a big difference there, a big benefit from an agricultural landscape. So I think everything has been encouraging. I haven't seen research looking at mortality potentially from pesticide drift. And I think that's something that we'll be looking for in the future. We've been trying to do everything we can around outreach, education, just talking about the topic of pesticide drift and trying to help ensure however we can that it's not going to happen on these sites. But obviously, we're in a lot of different agricultural landscapes, and maybe we do need to be designing these a little bit differently. Maybe there needs to be grass buffers around the edges that don't have flowers in them. So I feel like we're still in beginning stages of really understanding that topic.
Yeah, that's true too. And I should mention, I'm not aware of any studies that have specifically looked at insect mortality from the panels themselves. I just know that there are studies about birds and the panels, and these panels are generally considered safer than the other type of panels because they're not as hot, if that helps. Any more questions? I'm counting to 10 in my head. Cooking the soil organism. I know I said cooking the birds, which is probably not the best thing to say, but they do. I mean, it was pretty hot. No, I think what they've generally found is that because of the extensive root systems of the grasses and wildflowers and other native plants, is that they're actually having a cooling effect. And we see that in nature also. So when you start to get deeper rooted native plants, those areas are much cooler than, say, if you were to walk up and take a soil temperature probe right in the shoulder of a highway, for example, into a bare ground area, into an area where there's deep root systems growing. So that's just an inherent benefit of native vegetation, that they do tend to keep soil cooler. And they also, because it's cooler, the soil, not just the panels are more productive, but the soil can tend to be more productive too. There's an optimal temperature range that I can't come up with off the top of my head right now that is like the maximum productivity zone for soil. And obviously that varies given time of day. Soil temperatures don't all stay even with native vegetation, but there is an optimal temperature, and the native plants are able to help get us into that range. I think you definitely would cook things if you just had turf and gravel, but you also have less soil organisms in general. Oh, Jessica, I didn't even give you the opportunity to ask that question. Oh, I feel so bad. I just started answering it. I apologize. All right, we're right at 2 o'clock. So I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Dan, thanks so much for being so awesome and sharing all your solar and pollinator and habitat friendly knowledge. Thanks to myself for being equally awesome. It's weird to facilitate and present. Like, oh, partnership.
I'll thank you, Megan. Megan, thank you
Oh,
very
thank you.
much. And Dan, thank you very much for being a part of this Prairie Reconstruction Initiative webinar series.
Yep,
Yeah,
thank you.
thanks so much. All right, friends, have a great rest of your day. Keep doing good prairie work and try to find stackable benefits wherever you can. And you're absolutely right, the person in the chat, some plants don't grow under the panel.
Ooh, I have one last question,
Okay, I'm ready.
but everybody's, are there,
It's okay.
so are there incentives for developers or landowners